You guys just keep asking for the more Reddit stories. So, I'm ready with the new tale. Let's read some cool, interesting cheating wife Reddit stories. And guys, I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year, and I think we can do it. So please subscribe and let's get straight into this one. I found a protection in my wife's car, exposed her cheating, and what happened next is shocking. There are few things in life as gut-wrenching as betrayal, especially when it comes from the person you thought you knew best. I thought my wife, Sarah, and I were solid, a power couple, practically inseparable, both in our mid-30s and going strong for over a decade. But that was before I found the condom in her car. The day I discovered it, my life took a turn into a nightmare I never expected. It started as an ordinary Saturday. Sarah was out running errands, or so she claimed. We had a pretty smooth system. She handled the shopping while I took care of the house. But when she got home, she seemed a little off, distant. She was quick with her usual smile and the casual, "Hi, hon." But something in her eyes felt absent. I brushed it off. Everyone has off days, right? Little did I know this was the beginning of an unraveling. Later that evening, as Sarah sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I realized I'd left my wallet in her car. When I went out to retrieve it, I caught a glint of something out of place under the passenger seat. Reaching down, my fingers closed around a small foil packet, an unopened condom. I stared at it, dumbfounded. We hadn't used condoms in years. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it, my mind racing with questions. There was no logical reason for it to be there, at least not one I could bear to think of. I clenched the packet in my hand, feeling a strange blend of fury and fear bubble up inside me. This couldn't be happening. Not to us. We'd been through so much together. I shook my head, telling myself it had to be a misunderstanding. I shoved the condom back under the seat, taking a moment to breathe, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But even as I walked back inside, I knew I couldn't ignore what I'd found. The night dragged on as I watched Sarah, every move and gesture suddenly loaded with suspicion. Had she always been this guarded with her phone? Was it my imagination? Or did she seem to pull away slightly every time I tried to make small talk? The seed of doubt had been planted, and now it was growing at a frightening pace. For the next few days, I kept a close eye on her. She was smart, though. Cunning, even. Every time I thought I noticed something out of place, she had a perfect explanation, a disarming smile that made me question my own instincts. It was maddening. And then, one evening, my fears were all but confirmed. Sarah had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to shower, something she never did. She was notoriously private about her phone. I'm not proud of it, but I grabbed it. If she was hiding something, I needed to know. My fingers shook as I unlocked the screen. No password. But just as I opened her messages, her voice echoed down the hallway. "Honey, can you bring me a towel?" she called. I nearly dropped the phone in panic, shoving it back on the counter just as she stepped into the kitchen. She was wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping. She gave me a curious look, one eyebrow raised, but didn't say anything. I stammered some excuse about forgetting something and quickly left the room, heart hammering in my chest. Days passed, my suspicions festering. I was unraveling, growing more obsessed with uncovering the truth. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work. Every time Sarah left the house, I found myself wondering where she really was. The doubt gnawed at me, eating away any trust one once had. And then, finally, I got my break. One evening, after she'd fallen asleep, I managed to take her phone without waking her. Scrolling through her messages, I found a conversation buried under a contact labeled Ashley from yoga. But what I found was not Ashley. I knew that Sarah didn't have any friend named Ashley, and she'd never mentioned a new yoga class. My fingers shook as I opened the conversation. The messages were short, guarded, but they said enough. Ashley wasn't a woman at all. It was a man, and not just any man, but someone she'd clearly been meeting behind my back. The messages didn't give away everything. Sarah was smart about that. Still, each line felt like a needle in my chest. There was a pattern. A carefully timed message, "Tonight?" His reply, "Usual spot." Her response, coy and brief, "Can't wait." I read, hands trembling, stomach churning. Every phrase, every teasing reply, painted a picture I desperately wanted to unsee. I knew I had to confront her, but part of me wanted more proof. Something undeniable, something she couldn't dismiss as a misunderstanding. So, I decided to wait, to follow her. That weekend, I finally got my chance. Sarah told me she was going to a friend's birthday dinner. She'd be out late, she warned, and I played the role of the unsuspecting husband perfectly. I waved her off with a smile and settled down on the couch, waiting for the sound of her car pulling away before grabbing my keys and following her at a safe distance. She drove to the outskirts of town, the lights of the city dimming as we veered off into a residential area I didn't recognize. The streets were quieter here, houses spread out, casting long shadows across empty sidewalks. I kept a distance, careful to keep her in sight without alerting her to my presence. Finally, she pulled up to a small, secluded cafe. A man was waiting for her by the door, tall, with an easy smile, dressed a little too casually to be just a friend. I felt a wave of nausea as I watched Sarah step out of the car, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She wrapped her arms around him in a hug that lingered too long, her head resting on his shoulder. My fists clenched around the steering wheel, anger and betrayal coursing through me. I forced myself to stay put, watching as they disappeared inside. I waited for nearly an hour, the minutes dragging on, each one sharpening the anger I felt. I imagined bursting in, causing a scene, letting everyone know what kind of person Sarah really was. But as tempting as it was, I knew I needed more. This was too big to leave up to a hunch or an accusation. I needed something concrete. When they finally left, they didn't part ways. Instead, they walked arm in arm toward his car. That's when it hit me. They weren't going their separate ways. They were leaving together. My heart sank as I watched her get into his car. My wife, my Sarah, getting cozy with another man. I followed them out of the cafe's lot and into the night, keeping my distance. They drove to a nearby hotel, a cheap, nondescript place with a dimly lit sign. It was perfect for discretion, tucked away on a side street, the kind of place no one would think twice about. My stomach twisted as I watched them head toward the entrance together, laughing, completely oblivious to my presence. The urge to get out of the car and confront them both was almost overpowering, but I knew this was my chance to gather the final piece of evidence I needed. As they disappeared through the lobby doors, I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking as I took each one. I felt a hollow emptiness settle in my chest, a numbness that only came from pure, unfiltered pain. There was no denying it now. Sarah was cheating, and not just in a casual, flirtatious way. She was fully, deliberately involved with this man. They weren't meeting up for a one-time fling. No, this was a relationship, a hidden world she'd built outside of our marriage. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities, questions, accusations that would soon spill out the moment I saw her again. But as the initial shock faded, I felt something darker take its place, a cold, calculated fury. If she thought she could lie to me, betray me, and walk away unscathed, she was dead wrong. I was going to make sure of that. When Sarah finally came home hours later, she slipped into bed beside me, probably thinking I was fast asleep. I lay still, pretending to be asleep, listening to her breathing, trying to understand how the woman I'd loved for so long could betray me like this. I felt her shift, her hand brushing against mine as if to reassure me in her sleep. But I didn't flinch, didn't pull away. I just lay there, planning every detail of what I'd do to expose her betrayal taking shape in my mind. The next morning, I acted as if nothing was wrong. Sarah greeted me with her usual smile, the picture of a devoted wife, and I played along. I had to keep my cool if I wanted my plan to work. Step one was getting her to let her guard down, to think I was none the wiser. After all, I needed her comfortable, unaware of the storm that was coming. And then, when the moment was right, I'd make my move. But I needed more than photos and late-night spying to destroy her lies. I needed solid, undeniable evidence. It was time to dig deeper, to get my hands on every secret she'd been hiding. So, I started with her phone. If she thought I hadn't noticed her changing passwords, and guarding it like her life depended on it. She was wrong. I waited until she was in the shower, then grabbed her phone, unlocking it with a password I'd memorized weeks before. What I found next took everything to a new level. I scrolled through Sarah's phone, every tap bringing me closer to the truth she'd buried. There were messages, hundreds of them, between her and Ashley from yoga, a name she'd used to keep me off her trail. But reading through their exchanges, I saw everything. They texted daily, joking, sharing secrets, things she'd never told me. And the messages weren't just casual. They were intimate, dripping with emotion. My stomach churned as I saw how deeply entwined she was with this man. One thread caught my attention, a conversation where she described her husband. The words stung as I read them. She called me too serious, distant, even controlling. It was surreal, seeing the person I thought I knew painting me as a stranger. The things she was saying about me, it was like she had rewritten our entire relationship to justify her affair. But then, buried in a long string of messages, I found what I'd been looking for. Explicit confirmation of what they'd done, where they'd gone, and when. My hands shook as I read the words she'd sent him, describing their hotel meetings, the excitement of sneaking around, the thrill of hiding in plain sight. I felt a surge of nausea, a primal, gut-wrenching realization that I had lost her to someone else, someone who didn't care at all about the life we'd built together. I was consumed with rage, but I forced myself to remain calm. She thought she was clever, that she had hidden her betrayal perfectly, but she didn't know I was now fully aware of her double life, and that knowledge gave me power. Every piece of information I found gave me one more tool to use in my plan. This wasn't just going to be a confrontation. I was going to tear her world apart as thoroughly as she'd torn apart mine. When Sarah came out of the shower, I handed her phone back, casually placing it on the counter as if I hadn't just read her entire secret life. She glanced at it and then at me, but I kept my face neutral. She was smiling, even humming as she moved around the kitchen, her happiness like a slap to the face. How long had she been this bold, parading her lies right under my nose? As the day wore on, I realized my fury wasn't enough. I needed a solid plan. It was time to make her think everything was going back to normal. That night, I invited her out to dinner. She looked surprised but agreed, and soon we were at a cozy restaurant downtown, the kind of place we used to love. Sarah smiled at me over the candlelit table, her eyes bright, completely unaware that the man sitting across from her was planning her downfall. I kept the conversation light, steering it towards safe topics like work, weekend plans, and family. She played along, laughing, telling stories, seeming to relax as the evening went on. But every smile she gave me felt hollow. It was as if I were sitting across from a stranger. I pretended to go along, listening to her lies and nodding in agreement, every laugh and every smile hiding my true intentions. And then, halfway through our meal, she excused herself to use the restroom. I watched her go, her figure disappearing around the corner, and took a deep breath. I quickly pulled out my phone, snapped a photo of our half-finished meals, the wine glasses, the ambience of the restaurant. These photos weren't for memories. They were evidence, proof of how she'd played along, pretended, kept up this facade. When she returned, she had a lightness to her, as if our dinner date had somehow absolved her. I fought the urge to laugh at her audacity. She had no idea what I had in store. As we left the restaurant, Sarah slipped her arm around mine, leaning into me as we walked to the car. I forced myself to let her, fighting back the urge to shove her away. She didn't get to see the anger simmering beneath the surface. Not yet. I was playing the long game now, letting her sink into a false sense of security, lulling her into believing I was still blissfully unaware. Over the next few days, I laid low, gathering more evidence, putting the pieces together one by one. I needed to know how far this deception went. I started tracking her car, using a GPS device I bought online. I knew it was extreme, but the way I saw it, she'd forfeited any right to privacy the moment she decided to lie to me. Within a day, I'd confirmed what I already knew. Her regular errands were anything but. I watched as she'd head to places where she'd park for hours, not once considering I might be onto her. Each ping on the GPS filled me with a sense of grim satisfaction, proof that she'd been lying to my face and more fuel for the revenge I was planning. Then, on one rainy Thursday night, I got the confirmation I'd been waiting for. She was supposed to be working late, yet her car was parked in a neighborhood far from her office. The GPS showed her location as a small house I didn't recognize, and my stomach turned. I had a good idea of what I'd find if I went over there, but I needed one last piece of undeniable proof. I drove there, my mind running wild with images of what was happening behind closed doors. When I arrived, I parked down the street, just out of sight, and waited. After a few minutes, I saw Sarah's car parked outside a modest little house, its windows glowing warmly in the evening gloom. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my fingers tapping restlessly on the steering wheel. Finally, the front door opened, and there she was, stepping outside with him. They shared a kiss, not even bothering to check if anyone was watching. It was over. Any lingering hope I had for a rational explanation vanished. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. I now had everything I needed. Photos, texts, locations, and now, a final, damning image of her with him. She wouldn't be able to deny a single thing. When I got home that night, Sarah was already there, looking tired but content. She greeted me with a casual smile, the same smile that had fooled me for so long. But now, it only filled me with disgust. I didn't confront her yet. I wanted her to feel comfortable, to believe she was safe for just a little longer. There was a bitter satisfaction in knowing that while she thought everything was under control, her entire world was on the brink of imploding. She was living in a fantasy, and I was about to bring her crashing back to reality. The following morning, I made a call to a lawyer. Part 4, I made an appointment with one of the best divorce attorneys in town, a guy named Alan who specialized in cases like mine. I had no interest in a quiet, dignified separation. Sarah had destroyed everything we had, and I was going to make sure she paid for every single lie. If she thought she could walk away without consequences, she had another thing coming. When I arrived at Alan's office, he greeted me with a handshake and a sympathetic nod, his eyes quickly assessing me. It was clear he'd seen men like me before, hurt, betrayed, seeking justice. I didn't hold back. I laid out every detail, each message, the photos, the GPS logs, even the conversations I'd overheard. Alan listened patiently, taking notes, and after an hour of venting, he looked up with a shrewd smile. "This is a clear case of infidelity," he said. "If you want to move forward, you're in a strong position. With evidence this solid, we can make sure she's held accountable. You'll keep the house, your assets, everything." Alan's confidence was like a balm to my wounded pride. I told him I wanted to make this as public as possible, to ensure Sarah felt the full weight of her choices. He nodded, suggesting that we serve her the papers in a way she wouldn't forget. He recommended a private investigator as well, someone to gather even more proof that would eliminate any wiggle room she might think she had. That evening, I went home with a strange sense of satisfaction. Sarah, of course, was already there, smiling at me like she hadn't been out with him just the night before. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, humming to herself, setting the table for dinner. The ease with which she played the role of the devoted wife made my skin crawl. It was like she believed her double life would never catch up to her, that she could have it all, me, her marriage, and her fling. As we sat down to eat, I decided to push her buttons, just to see how she'd react. I picked at my food, watching her closely, noting every small reaction, every nervous glance. I asked her about her day, her friends, even threw in a question about her so-called yoga class, and I could see her tense just slightly, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. "What about you, honey?" she asked, clearly trying to deflect. "How's work?" "Oh, the usual," I replied smoothly, hiding the satisfaction in my voice. "But I've been thinking a lot about trust and loyalty lately. They're the foundation of any good relationship, don't you think?" Her smile flickered again, a flash of something close to guilt flashing in her eyes, but she recovered quickly, nodding. "Of course," she said softly, not quite meeting my gaze. "Trust is everything." I felt a rush of cold satisfaction. She had no idea what I had up my sleeve. I could almost pity her, almost. A few days later, I met with the private investigator Alan had recommended. a man named Joe who looked like he'd seen his fair share of deception and lies. He listened as I laid out my suspicions, showing him the evidence I'd already gathered. He studied everything carefully, nodding, and told me he'd need a week to get me everything I needed. The following days felt like torture. I watched Sarah go about her routine, each gesture a reminder of the lies she was living. Every time she smiled at me, every casual "I love you" she tossed my way, I felt my anger deepen. It was almost as if she'd convinced herself that her lies weren't hurting anyone. She thought she was in control, but all the while, she had no idea her world was about to implode. Exactly a week later, Joe called me. He sounded almost excited, telling me he had everything I needed and more. We met in a cafe downtown, and he laid out the photos, timestamps, everything in neat, damning order. "She's been seeing him regularly," he said, glancing at me as he slid a series of photos across the table. They showed Sarah with her lover, holding hands, laughing, and kissing in public places, looking like a couple without a care in the world. "She doesn't seem to suspect a thing." I clenched my jaw as I looked over the images, each one hammering home the reality of her betrayal. The intimacy, the closeness. It was as if she were living an entirely different life, one where I didn't exist. Joe continued, detailing how he'd tracked them to their favorite spots, their routine meetings. He even had video footage of them entering the same hotel I'd followed her to that night. "Thank you, Joe," I said, swallowing down the bitter taste in my mouth as I gathered the photos. This is exactly what I needed. I knew now that the time had come to make my move. That night, I prepared everything. I printed copies of the photos, all of them, placing them in an envelope labeled, "For Sarah." I packed a few of my own things, setting aside my essentials. This was going to be my final night in the house, the last time I'd pretend to be oblivious. Tomorrow, she'd get the shock of her life. That evening, I sat across from her at dinner, feeling a strange sense of calm. Sarah chattered on about her day, oblivious as always, while I watched her, memorizing every feature, every mannerism. This was the last time I'd see her as my wife. Tomorrow, she'd be something else entirely, a stranger, a liar, someone who had destroyed everything we'd built. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her, knowing what was coming. In some twisted way, I almost enjoyed the anticipation, the knowledge that soon, she'd be forced to face the truth. Tomorrow morning, when she opened that envelope and saw the photos, there'd be no more lies, no more pretending. I was awake long before she was, my heart pounding with adrenaline as I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter. I left the keys to the house beside it, a final, symbolic gesture. And then, I walked out, feeling a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. Later that day, while I sat in Alan's office waiting to finalize the papers, my phone rang. It was Sarah. I didn't answer. She called again, and I let each call go to voicemail, knowing exactly what had triggered her panic. When I finally listened to her messages, her voice was frantic, confused, each message more desperate than the last. "What is this?" she cried in one of the messages. "Why are you doing this? Please, Mike, I can explain. Just pick up the phone." But I didn't. I let her sit in the silence, let her twist in the confusion, wondering how I'd manage to uncover her secret. She was in damage control mode now, trying to salvage whatever she could. But there was nothing left to save. As I drove back to the house later that evening to gather my things, she was waiting for me, standing on the porch, her face pale and drawn, eyes rimmed with red. She tried to speak as I approached, reaching out as if to touch me, but I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Don't," I said coldly, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You've done enough." "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Just let me explain." "Explain what?" I shot back, my voice laced with anger. "Explain how you've been lying to me for months? Explain how you've been sneaking around with him, pretending you could get away with it." Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks, but I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy, nothing but a hollow, burning rage. She tried to speak, but I cut her off. "You've made your choice, Sarah," I said, turning away from her. "And now, you'll live with the consequences." I could feel her eyes on me as I walked past her, back into the house that had once been ours, to gather the last of my things. Part 5. As I packed up the last of my things, I could hear Sarah sobbing outside, her cries muffled but desperate, each one a strange, hollow echo of what had once been our life together. I knew she'd be out there, standing on that porch, waiting for any scrap of forgiveness I might offer. But I was beyond that now, too hurt, too angry, and honestly, too disgusted by the woman I'd discovered her to be. By the time I walked out with my bags, her face was a mess of tears, her eyes bloodshot, makeup smeared. She took a step toward me, her hand reaching out as if she thought there was still a chance to repair the damage she'd done. "Mike, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what you think you know, but I can't explain everything. It's not what it looks like, I swear." I stared at her, feeling a surge of contempt wash over me. The excuses, the half-truths, the lies. It was all so predictable. She'd spent months sneaking around, building this elaborate deception, and now, when it all came crashing down, she thought she could smooth it over with a few empty words? The irony was almost laughable. "Oh, really?" I said, my tone sharp and cold. "Then tell me, Sarah, what exactly is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I know it is. You lied. You cheated. And you thought I was too blind, too trusting to ever find out." Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face as she took in my words. I could see the panic setting in, the realization that her lies were finally unraveling in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a strangled, desperate noise as she tried to gather herself. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she managed to choke out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Mike, you have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you. Did you think of that when you were sneaking out to meet him?" I demanded, my voice rising. "When you were lying to my face every single day, did you stop to think about what this would do to me?" She recoiled, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. But I was past feeling sympathy for her. All I could see was the betrayal, the months of deception, every lie she'd fed me in that soft, trusting voice. "Mike, I'm so sorry," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But I can fix it, I swear. Just, please, give me a chance to make this right." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Make it right?" I repeated, shaking my head. "There's no making this right, Sarah. You've spent months lying to me, betraying everything we had, and now you want to pretend that an apology will fix it? It doesn't work like that." She took another step toward me, desperation written all over her face. "Please, Mike, we can go to therapy. I'll do anything, whatever it takes to make this right. Just don't leave." Her words were almost laughable, like some kind of pathetic last-ditch effort to cling to the life she'd thrown away. It was almost tragic, really, watching her beg for something she'd so carelessly destroyed. But I wasn't interested in her apologies, her promises, or any of the flimsy excuses she might offer. "It's too late, Sarah," I said, my voice hard and unyielding. "You made your choice, and now you'll live with it. I'm done. We're done." With that, I turned and walked to my car, leaving her standing there, broken and defeated, on the doorstep of the life she'd just shattered. I didn't look back, didn't let myself feel even a shred of pity for her. She didn't deserve it, not after what she'd done. The next few days passed in a blur. I stayed with a friend, someone who knew what I was going through and didn't ask questions. Alan, my lawyer, moved quickly, getting the divorce papers in order and scheduling the process to move as fast as possible. With the evidence I had, Sarah wouldn't have a leg to stand on. Then, 2 days after I left, something unexpected happened. I was sitting at a cafe, trying to clear my head, when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I opened it, my stomach sinking as I read the text. "I know what Sarah did to you, and I think you deserve to know the full story. Meet me at Parker's Diner tomorrow at noon. I'll be in the back booth." I stared at the message, suspicion prickling at the back of my mind. I had no idea who the message was from, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. Whoever this was, they knew something I needed to hear. The next day, I arrived at the diner a few minutes early, scanning the booths until I spotted a man in his early 40s, looking somewhat uneasy as he sipped his coffee. He glanced up as I approached, giving me a tight nod. "Are you the one who texted me?" I asked, my voice cautious. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. "Yeah, thanks for coming." I slid into the booth, my mind racing with questions. "Who are you?" He took a deep breath, his eyes darting around the diner as if to make sure no one was listening. "My name's Eric," he said finally. "I know this is going to sound strange, but I think we have a mutual problem. My wife, Jessica, is also seeing your wife's lover." My heart stopped. I stared at him, trying to process his words. "What are you talking about?" Eric sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I know this is insane, but I had my suspicions about my wife for a while. I found out about her affair a few weeks ago, and when I started digging, I found out she's not the only one. This guy, he's been sleeping with both of our wives." A sick feeling settled in my stomach as his words sank in. I knew that Sarah's lover was nothing more than a fling. But this? The thought of him carrying on multiple affairs, playing both of our wives like puppets, made my blood boil. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice tight with anger. "Because I think you deserve to know who you're dealing with," Eric said quietly. "I know how it feels, the betrayal, the lies. I thought maybe we could help each other get some closure, figure out exactly what these people have been doing behind our backs." I sat back, struggling to control the surge of anger rising within me. This man, whoever he was, had destroyed 2 marriages, played with 2 lives, as if we meant nothing. But as furious as I was, I realized that Eric was right. I needed to know the full truth, to understand the extent of the lies. "What do you have in mind?" I asked, meeting Eric's gaze. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've been tracking I have more evidence than you can imagine. Photos, dates, even details of the places they've been meeting. If we work together, we can take him down, make sure he doesn't get away with this." As he spoke, a dark plan began to form in my mind. I could expose this man, ruin his life the way he'd ruined ours. And if I had to work with Eric to make that happen, so be it. The 2 of us spent hours going over every detail, planning our next moves with ruthless precision. By the end of it, we had a strategy, a blueprint for revenge that would leave no room for either of our spouses to hide. And as I left the diner that day, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a thrill of anticipation for what was to come. Sarah and her lover had torn my life apart. Now, it was my turn to do the same. The plan we devised was brutal, methodical, and perfectly calculated. It would be enough to not only expose Sarah and her lover, but to leave them scrambling, reputations destroyed, lives left in tatters. Eric and I didn't want just a simple confrontation. No, we wanted something more. The kind of revenge that would echo, leaving scars they'd never forget. Over the next few days, Eric and I met regularly, piecing together every scrap of evidence we had. I'd thought my findings were thorough, but Eric had taken things to a whole new level. He had tracked his wife, Jessica, and Sarah's lover through GPS records, personal messages, and even video footage from a private investigator he'd hired. He'd managed to pull data from hotel records, itemized receipts, and timestamps from credit card purchases. There was a meticulousness to his investigation that left me in awe. It was clear that Eric wasn't just a man scorned. He was determined to dismantle this man's life. One evening, Eric called me, his voice excited and almost sinister. "I've found the weak link," he said. "This guy, let's call him Mark, has been lying to everyone around him. His boss, his family, his friends. He has a pretty well-polished image, but if even half of what I've discovered goes public, he'll lose everything." We arranged to meet the next day to finalize the details. That night, I barely slept, adrenaline keeping me awake as I envisioned the fallout. I could see it all so clearly, the confrontation, the shock on Sarah's face when she realized I had known all along, and Mark's perfect life crumbling beneath him. When we met the next day, Eric brought a folder filled with damning information. We planned everything down to the last detail, carefully calculating how to make the revelation as public and humiliating as possible. We'd reveal everything at once, ensuring no one would be able to turn a blind eye to the truth. Once the plan was set, we both left with a grim sense of satisfaction. It was only a matter of days now. On the morning of the big day, I felt an odd calmness. My phone buzzed, and it was a message from Eric. "It's happening tonight. Are you ready?" "Absolutely," I replied, a smile playing on my lips. That evening, I arranged for Sarah to meet me at a restaurant, a favorite of ours from the early days of our marriage. She thought it was a reconciliation dinner, a chance to talk things through and make things right. Little did she know, this dinner was about to become a spectacle she'd never forget. Meanwhile, Eric had set up a meeting with Mark. He'd planned it perfectly, ensuring they would arrive just as Sarah and I were seated, putting the two of them in direct view of each other. I could hardly contain the thrill as I envisioned the moment when they'd come face to face. No excuses left, no more lies to hide behind. The restaurant was crowded when Sarah and I arrived, the usual hum of clinking glasses and quiet conversation filling the air. I watched her closely as we sat down, noting the way she glanced around, her gaze flickering nervously. Perhaps she sensed something off, or maybe she was simply on edge, knowing she'd been caught. "Mike," she began, reaching across the table to place her hand over mine. "I just want to say thank you for giving me a chance to explain. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I really do love you." The lie was like poison, and I forced myself to keep my face neutral, to pretend as if I hadn't already seen through every word. Her love was as hollow as her apologies, and tonight, she was about to see just how little those empty words meant to me. Just as she finished, the door opened, and I saw Eric and Mark step inside. Mark didn't notice us at first. He was too busy talking, laughing, oblivious to the tension building in the room. But then his gaze fell on our table, and he froze, his face going pale as he realized who he was looking at. Beside me, Sarah stiffened, her hands slipping from mine as her eyes darted between Mark and me, panic flashing in her gaze. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time, she was speechless, caught in a web of her own making. "Mike, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let's just go somewhere private and talk about this." "Oh, I think we're just fine here," I said, my voice calm and cold. "I'd rather we stay. After all, it looks like we have company." Eric walked up to our table, Mark trailing behind him like a ghost, his face drained of any color. Eric gave me a nod, then turned his attention to Sarah and Mark, his expression hard and unyielding. "Sarah, Mark," Eric said, his tone icy. "It's time we all had a little chat, don't you think?" The color drained from Sarah's face, her eyes wide with fear as she glanced at Mark, who stood frozen, his gaze locked on the floor as if he could make himself disappear. I could see the panic setting in, the dawning realization that her secret was exposed. "Mike, Eric, please," Sarah stammered, her voice trembling. "This isn't what it looks like. Not what it looks like?" I interrupted, laughing bitterly. "Sarah, do you even know how many lies you've told at this point? How many times you've looked me in the eye and lied to my face?" Eric turned to Mark, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "And you," he said, his voice laced with disgust. "You had the audacity to think you could play us all for fools, that you could sneak around behind our backs and not suffer any consequences. Well, you were wrong." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Eric cut him off, his voice rising. "Don't even try to deny it. We have everything, photos, messages, videos. We know exactly what you've been doing, where, when, and with who. And as of this moment, so does everyone else." With a swift motion, Eric pulled out a thick envelope and dropped it on the table in front of Sarah and Mark. I could see their hands shaking as they opened it, their faces going slack as they realized the full extent of the evidence against them. Every photo, every text, every little detail of their affair, laid out for them to see. The restaurant had grown quiet, patrons looking over, sensing the tension, their murmurs filling the silence as Sarah and Mark sat frozen, unable to look at us. Sarah's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears as she glanced at me, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Mike, I didn't mean for this to happen. You didn't mean for this to happen?" I echoed, my voice filled with cold fury. "Sarah, You destroyed everything we had. All for what? A few stolen moments? Lies, betrayal, and for what? Was it worth it? She looked down, silent, as if the weight of her betrayal had finally settled upon her. For the first time, she seemed to understand the depth of the pain she'd caused, the devastation she'd left in her wake. But it was far too late for regrets. Eric turned to Mark, his expression one of pure disgust. "And as for you," he said, his voice low and menacing, "I hope you enjoy the fallout. Because as of this moment, I've sent every piece of evidence to your boss, your family, and everyone else who believed in the facade you put up." Mark's face twisted in horror, his eyes wide with disbelief. You sent it to my boss?" Eric's smile was chilling. "Oh yes. By tomorrow, everyone in your life will know exactly who you are and what you've been up to. Your family, your friends, your colleagues. You thought you could live a double life, but that life is over. Consider this your reckoning." Mark stood there, stunned, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find words. But there was nothing he could say, no excuse he could offer. The weight of his choices had finally come crashing down on him, and he looked like a man who had just lost everything. I turned back to Sarah, her tear-streaked face a pitiful sight. "I loved you," I said, my voice breaking. "I trusted you, and you destroyed everything for this?" She sobbed, but I felt nothing but emptiness. This was the end of us, the final, brutal conclusion to the life we had once shared. Without another word, I walked away, Eric by my side, leaving them to face the wreckage they'd created. As we stepped outside, I felt an odd sense of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders. I was free from the lies, the betrayal, and the woman who had shattered my trust. Eric and I parted ways in the parking lot, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. We had both lost something that night, but we had also regained something else: dignity, strength, and the knowledge that justice had been served. I drove away, not looking back, feeling a strange sense of closure. My life was irrevocably changed, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The fallout from that night spread faster than I could have imagined. By morning, word had reached every corner of Sarah's world, from her friends to her family, even to her workplace. As I expected, people were shocked. They didn't know her like I did, didn't see the calculated way she had juggled her double life, keeping everyone in the dark. All they saw was the charming, loyal Sarah. But now, all her secrets were in the open, and it was time for her to deal with the mess she had created. The first text I received that morning was from Sarah's mother. Her words were simple, short, barely more than a handful, but each one struck with a force that left me breathless. "I'm so sorry, Mike. We had no idea. Please let us know how we can make this right." For a moment, I felt a pang of regret. Her family had been like a second family to me. They'd welcomed me into their lives with open arms from the beginning. They'd trusted me with their daughter, believed in the life we'd built together. I thought about replying, but decided against it. I knew they were probably just as blindsided as I had been, but I couldn't deal with more apologies. I needed to move on. The messages kept coming. Sarah's friends, our mutual friends, even a few of her coworkers, all offering condolences, shock, and anger on my behalf. It was like they were trying to shield me from a storm that had already passed. I didn't respond to any of them. The support was comforting, but it couldn't erase the betrayal or ease the bitterness in my heart. Later that day, I received another call from Alan, my lawyer. He was quick and efficient, outlining the next steps, making sure everything was on track. "You're in a solid position, Mike," he assured me. "With all the evidence, this divorce will be swift, and you'll keep everything. She's forfeited any right to fight back." I thanked him and hung up, a grim satisfaction settling in. It was a small victory, but one that mattered. Sarah would leave with nothing: no house, no car, no share of our assets. All she'd have left were memories and the weight of the mistakes she'd made. That evening, as I sat alone in my new apartment, my phone rang. It was Sarah. I considered ignoring it, but a part of me wanted to hear what she had to say now that her world had come crashing down. I let it ring a few times before finally picking up, my voice cold and emotionless. "Mike, please, just let me explain," she said. her voice barely a whisper. She sounded broken, like a woman clinging to the last shreds of her life, desperate for forgiveness. "There's nothing to explain, Sarah," I replied, my tone hard. "I know everything. I know about the lies, the betrayal, the countless nights you spent with him. I know all of it." She let out a shuddering breath, her voice cracking. "Mike, I'm sorry. I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing. I never meant to hurt you." "Didn't know what you were doing?" I laughed bitterly. "Every single day, you made a choice, Sarah. You chose him over me, over everything we had. You knew exactly what you were doing." She was silent for a long moment, and I could hear her trying to gather herself. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she whispered, her voice filled with raw, desperate guilt. "But please, I don't want to lose everything. Not like this." "You should have thought about that before," I replied, my voice cold. "You don't get to destroy our marriage and then walk away unscathed. You made your bed, Sarah. Now lie in it." She started sobbing, begging for one more chance, pleading for me to reconsider the divorce. She promised to change, to go to therapy, to do whatever it took to make things right. But I felt nothing. No pity, no compassion, no warmth. She'd killed all of that when she'd chosen him over me. "I'm done, Sarah," I said finally. "There's nothing left to save. I gave you everything, and you threw it away. So, consider this goodbye." And with that, I hung up, feeling a strange sense of finality. It was over. The life we'd built, the years we'd spent together, they were just ashes now, scattered and gone. But life, as it often does, had one final twist in store for me. 2 days later, I received an email. It was from someone I didn't recognize, a woman named Olivia. She introduced herself briefly, explaining that she had heard about what had happened between Sarah and me. She apologized for intruding, but she had something urgent to share, something I needed to know. "My husband is Mark," she wrote. "The same Mark who was with your wife. I've been dealing with his betrayal on my own, trying to make sense of it all. But there's something you don't know, something neither of us could have expected." My heart pounded as I read on, the words blurring as I tried to process what she was telling me. Mark, it turned out, wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a con artist, a manipulator who had been carrying on multiple affairs, stringing along several women, each one oblivious to the others. He was charming, charismatic, a master at weaving lies that seemed all too real. But the real shock came in the next paragraph. "I don't know if you were aware," Olivia wrote, "but my husband has a record. He's done this before, to other women in other towns. He seduces them, earns their trust, and then drains them financially. He targets vulnerable people, manipulates them into giving him everything. And once he's taken what he wants, he disappears." I felt my blood run cold as I read her words. This wasn't just about an affair. Sarah had been involved with a man who preyed on people, using their trust and affection to exploit them. Suddenly, her betrayal took on a darker, more twisted dimension. I called Olivia immediately, needing to hear her story firsthand. She answered on the second ring, her voice quiet but steady. She told me everything, detailing the years of manipulation, the lies, the heartbreak. She described how Mark had seduced her with promises of a life together, only to use her money, her resources, until he'd left her nearly penniless. "He's been doing this for years," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "He finds women who are unhappy, who want something more. He charms them, makes them believe they're special, and then he takes everything he can." I was speechless, the reality of it sinking in. Sarah had been just another pawn in his game, a piece in a much larger, twisted puzzle. She had thrown away her marriage, her life, for a man who cared about nothing but his own gain. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally, my voice thick with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I had no idea." Olivia was silent for a moment, and then she said something that left me stunned. "You're not the only one he's hurt, Mike. There are others. I've tracked them down, women from all over, each with a similar story. If you want, we can take this public. Expose him. Make sure he never does this to anyone else again." I felt a surge of determination. This man had not only destroyed my marriage, but he had hurt countless others, leaving a trail of broken lives in his wake. I couldn't let him continue. I agreed, and over the next few days, Olivia and I worked tirelessly, contacting the other women, gathering every detail, every piece of evidence. We compiled a comprehensive file, a dossier of Mark's crimes, preparing to go public. Finally, the day came. We sent everything we had to the local news stations, and within hours, the story exploded. News outlets picked it up, the headlines plastered across every channel, every website. Mark's face was everywhere, his web of lies exposed for the world to see. Sarah called me in a panic, begging me to make it stop, pleading for my help, but she'd made her choice, and now she was reaping the consequences. The fallout was swift and brutal. Mark was arrested within days, facing charges not only for fraud and embezzlement, but for his pattern of manipulation and abuse. Sarah, meanwhile, was left to face the shame and humiliation of her role in his twisted scheme, her reputation shattered beyond repair. And as for me, I finally felt free. The betrayal, the lies, the anger, it was all behind me. I had lost the life I'd once known, but I had gained something far more valuable: my self-respect, my dignity, and the strength to rebuild. When I looked at the rubble of my past, I realized it didn't matter anymore. I was ready to move forward, leaving Sarah, Mark, and all their darkness far, far behind. After the public exposure of Mark's crimes, my life shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, I wasn't just the betrayed husband. I was the man who'd brought down a predator, a manipulator who'd preyed on vulnerable women. People I hadn't heard from in years reached out, offering support, sharing their shock over Sarah's actions, and praising my strength. Yet, as much as they sympathized, they couldn't really understand the weight of what I'd gone through. This wasn't some story for the gossip mill. It was the life I'd watched shatter before my eyes. I focused on rebuilding. My work became a refuge, a way to regain control over my life. I poured myself into my career, working late nights, tackling new projects. My colleagues respected my silence, giving me space while also encouraging me to move forward. Slowly, I felt a semblance of normalcy creeping back, like a wound healing layer by layer. The bitterness I'd carried for so long began to fade, replaced by a newfound resilience, a sense of peace in having come through the worst. One morning, months after everything had gone public, I received a letter. It was from Sarah, hand-delivered and neatly sealed in an envelope, addressed to my new apartment. I hesitated, the sight of her handwriting stirring old memories, both painful and bittersweet. Part of me wanted to toss it straight into the trash, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, steeling myself for whatever she had to say. Her letter was surprisingly short, barely a page, yet every word was weighted with regret and remorse. She acknowledged the pain she'd caused, the trust she'd shattered, and the family and friends she'd hurt in the process. She didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did she try to justify her actions. Instead, she offered a simple explanation, a last-ditch effort to make sense of her own mistakes. "Mike," she wrote, "I don't expect you to understand, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I lost myself somewhere along the way. I convinced myself that I needed more, that I deserved some happiness outside of what we had, not realizing how much I'd throw away in the process. Mark was a fantasy, an escape, and I was a fool to believe in him. I know you'll never be able to forget what I did, but please know I'll always regret hurting you, the man who gave me everything." I read her words once, then again, feeling a strange, hollow sadness in my chest. Her letter wasn't enough to change anything, nor did it erase the betrayal. But in a strange way, it allowed me to release the final remnants of my anger. I folded the letter, placing it back in the envelope before slipping it into a drawer, deciding that would be the last time I looked at it. Whatever her reasons, whatever her regrets, they were hers to carry now. In the weeks that followed, I found myself moving forward more easily, a sense of freedom replacing the weight I'd carried for so long. I'd started seeing a therapist to process everything, and with their help, I began to understand my own journey, recognizing the strength it had taken to stand up for myself, to walk away, and to finally find closure. One weekend, I took a trip to the coast, a place I'd always loved but hadn't visited in years. The crashing waves and endless horizon felt symbolic, a vast, open world waiting for me to step into. I sat by the shore, letting the wind and salt air wash over me, feeling a sense of peace settle into my bones. For the first time, I didn't feel like the man whose marriage had been destroyed. I felt like someone new, someone stronger, wiser, ready to embrace life without the weight of betrayal holding me back. During that trip, I met someone, a woman named Rachel. She was kind, thoughtful, with a quiet strength that reminded me of who I used to be before my life had unraveled. We struck up a conversation over coffee, talking about everything and nothing, sharing stories and laughter. There was no pressure, no expectations, just a natural, easy connection that felt like a breath of fresh air. As the weeks turned into months, Rachel and I grew closer, our bond strengthening with each passing day. She knew about my past, the wounds I still carried, but she never pushed, never demanded more than I was willing to give. She became a steady presence in my life, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, there was still light to be found. One evening, as we walked along the beach together, she took my hand, her touch warm and grounding. "I know you've been through a lot, Mike," she said softly, "but I hope you know you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Her words hit me deeply, a gentle reassurance that I'd finally found someone who understood, someone who didn't see me as a broken man, but as someone who'd fought his way through the fire and emerged whole. I realized then that I was no longer defined by my past. The betrayal, the anger, the pain. It was all part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. I was ready to start a new chapter, with Rachel by my side. Looking back, I knew I'd never forget what Sarah had done, the lessons I'd learned from the heartbreak. But I also knew that those scars were just that, scars, reminders of battles fought and won. I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and with a heart that, while battered, was still open to love. As Rachel and I stood together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I'd found closure, healing, and hope, and I knew that no matter what the future held, I was ready for it. This was my new beginning, a chance to live, to love, and to finally, truly be free. Oh my God, another really good one. I really hope you enjoyed this Reddit story video. I had a great time reading this. If you want more of this kind of content, just leave a comment, let me know. Follow my channel. I'm really trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year. And we can do it. It's going to happen, guys. Thank you so much. Now, everybody have a great night and have a sweet dreams.